Today I'm going to show you how to make a gamepad cursor with the new input system. So right now I'm using the mouse and I can press the button as usual, but when I switch over to a controller you'll see that it immediately changes to this little icon, and we can hover over the button and click, and then when we click out of the button it will unselect the button. And so when we switch back to the mouse you'll see that the mouse is at the same position where the cursor was, and when we switch back the cursor is at the same position where the mouse was. And so you can have this seamless transition between gamepad and mouse. Before we start, I want to thank GeekZebra on our Discord server. His help made this video possible, so thank you so much, and be sure to thank him as well. So first we need the new input system, so go to Windows, Package Manager. Up here you go to Unity Registry, then scroll down until you see Input System. And so this will work on either 1.0.2 or 1.1.1. It should work on the previous versions. I haven't tested it, but it should work the same. So you can choose the version you want. I'll just choose 1.0.2 and click install. Then click yes to restart the editor. Alright, once it's restarted, we have the new input system installed now. I want to mention that under the input system you have these samples and there's a gamepad mouse cursor. So Unity has made their own implementation of this, however I would not recommend using this one. For example, if I import that, there's a couple problems with this. One being that you can't actually use the mouse for anything, it only works with the gamepad. So if we use the gamepad, you'll see that it moves this little mouse. For some reason it's not even showing the cursor correctly, and it scrolls. But we're also going to be able to do that with our implementation. And the cursor can go out of bounds, which is not good. And so another issue with this is that if you want to change it, it's pretty complicated, because if you go to the cursor, they have this virtual mouse script and that's what they use. And if you edit the script, you'll see that there's just a lot of stuff going on and it's just kind of hard to change it because it's just pretty confusing. So let's get started with our own implementation. So let's make a new scene, create scene, and let's just call this gamepad cursor. I'm going to put that under scenes. Let's go to that. Alright, and let's make a folder for our scripts if you don't have one already. And then here we're going to create a script called gamepad cursor. And we'll be using this script and attach it to our game object. So before we dive into that script, let's just set up a simple button. So right click and create a UI button. Alright, you can double click that. And let's just kind of put it near the center so we can see it better. And increase this scale. Alright, and then in the event system, we're going to want to replace this old input system module with the new one. So just click this button, and you'll see that now the event system works with the new input system. However, we'll be changing this in a bit. Now let's create our cursor, which is just an image. So right click on your canvas, UI, image, and let's call this cursor. And for our cursor, the samples already comes with a crosshair if you want to use that. Or if you'd like, Kenney has a free crosshair pack that you can download, and it comes with a bunch of crosshairs for free. So if you download it and extract the zip file, you can go into PNG and there's different colors you can choose from. If you click black, then you'll see the black crosshairs. And if you'd like, you can just make a new folder here called images or sprites, and you can drag whichever one you want. So let's say we do crosshair 137, then under texture type, go to sprite so we can use it in our UI. And just click apply. If you go to the actual image, we can go to the properties and we'll see that this is 64 by 64 pixels. So if you want to make it accurate with the Unity pixels, just put 64 here and click apply. And then in the cursor, you can just drag and drop your source image there and you'll see that we have this image now. So a few things I want to mention is that for the pivot, so if you click here, we can set the pivot of this image. So make sure it's set to the center. If it's not, this might not work properly. To set the pivot, just press Shift and just select the middle one. And if you'd like, you can press Shift and Alt to also change the position. And finally, we want to disable raycast target under the image. And so this will ignore our cursor when shooting raycast from the camera to determine what UI we're hovering over. And we also want to make sure that our cursor is at the bottom of the canvas in the hierarchy, so it can get rendered over the other UI elements. So in the Unity UI, the bottommost element is rendered on top of the previous ones. So if we actually move the cursor upwards, you'll see that it disappears. Alright, so now let's make our script. I'm just going to make an empty game object and I'm just going to call it gamepad cursor. And we can just attach our script we made there. You can right click and edit the script. Alright, so the way we're going to do this is we're going to use a virtual mouse in the new input system. And so a virtual mouse is basically similar to a normal mouse, but it's not a physical mouse. We can actually change the position of a virtual mouse. And this is used for gamepad input. So in our case, we're using our gamepad to move the cursor around, and in reality, we're moving a virtual mouse, and that is what the UI will be reading, the virtual mouse input. So we'll take the gamepad input, we'll pipe it into a virtual mouse, and that virtual mouse will be used in our event system to see if we're over a UI or if we're pressing down over a UI element. So I'm just going to delete these functions and also remove these system collections namespaces. All right, so let's begin. So when we enable this script on enable, what we want to do is make a virtual mouse. So what we can do here is do private mouse, virtual mouse. So this is going to be our mouse. And we can say if virtual mouse equals null, so we don't have one yet, then let's create one. Virtual mouse equals, and then here we're going to have to add in a class, and it will be using Unity Engine .input system .low level. So we're going to be going into the low level of the input system. So we need this to be able to change the virtual mouse state. And we'll also need the Unity Engine .input system namespace for the mouse. So here we can do input system .add device parentheses, and then we pass in something called virtual mouse, which is a string. And you'll see there's an error. We can't convert from an input device to a mouse. So we can just cast it to a mouse up here. And now we can assign it to our virtual mouse. And actually we'll be using this namespace a little bit later. All right, so if virtual mouse is null, if it's not null, so else if it's not null, but it hasn't been added yet, so virtual mouse.added to the system, then we can do input system.add device, and then we can just add in the existing virtual mouse. Now, once we add this virtual mouse, if we're using a player input component, it won't actually link it to our input action asset that the player input component is using. So we need to link it manually. So we'll need a reference to our player input component. So we can do private player input, which we'll actually make soon. And I'm just going to make this a serialized field so we can drag it from the inspector. And then we need to import another namespace actually called using Unity Engine .input system .users. So we'll need this to change the users. All right, then here we can do input user .perform pairing with device, pass in the virtual mouse that we made, and then we pass in our player input user, which is player input .user. So this will connect our virtual mouse with our player input component so we can use it. That's if you're using the player input component. All right, now that we've linked it, we have to make a function that kind of runs like an update function that updates our cursor when we move our gamepad. So we can make a function here called private void update motion, and this will update the virtual mouse accordingly. And what we can do is call input system on after update plus equals, so we're subscribing to an event, and it will call our update motion on each frame that this is updated after it's updated, similar to a late update function. But before we do this, we want to actually make sure the virtual mouse is in the correct location before we update it. So kind of like setting the initial position of the cursor. So to do that, we'll need our reference to our cursor, so serialized field. And we can do a private rect transform, and we can call this cursor transform. So we'll get a reference to our cursor transform, and what we can do here is do if cursor transform does not equal null. Then we can get the position of the cursor, so we can do vector2 position equals cursor transform dot anchored position. So the anchored position takes into account the anchors of a rect transform. You can see the position of the pivot of this rect transform relative to the anchor reference point. And so we'll actually be setting this later so it can change according to our gamepad input. And then we can do input state dot change. So we're changing the state in the input system. We're changing the state of the virtual mouse position with our new position, which is basically wherever our cursor is currently at. So we can set the starting position in the editor. And this uses the input system low level namespace. All right, and make sure to make an onDisable function and unsubscribe from this event. Input system dot onAfterUpdate minus equals update motion, because we don't want to do this if the script is disabled. All right, in the update function of our cursor movement, What we'll do here is basically read the value of our gamepad, pipe it into the virtual mouse, and then change the position of the cursor image on the screen. So first we want to run some checks. If virtual mouse equals null, or the current gamepad, so gamepad.current, the one that's connected to your computer or your system, equals null, then let's just return from this function. So if we don't have a virtual mouse or we don't have a gamepad, then we don't even want to run this, right? Now we want to read the value of our gamepad, so we can do vector2 stick value. So this is the joystick value. Then we can do gamepad.current.left stick, or whichever stick you want. You can do .right stick as well. Just gonna do .left stick and read value. This will return a vector2. So this returns how much the stick is moving, and we want to take into account our delta time as well as some speed that we want to move it at. So up here, let's just declare a speed like a multiplier. So we can do private float cursor speed as an example, and maybe set it at like 1,000. I found that to be a good value, and you can make this modifiable in your game. All right, and then here we can do stick value times equals speed times time.delta time. So now we're taking into account the speed and the time delta time. So now that we have the delta, which is the change in position between the previous and the current frame, we want to take into account our current position and add the delta to it, similar to the slope, mx plus b. So we can do vector2 current position equals, let's do virtual mouse.position.read value. So we're reading the value, and then we can just do vector2 new position equals the current position plus the stick value, or in this case, I'm just going to rename it delta value so it could be easier to understand. Now we want to make sure that this doesn't go out of bounds from our screen. We have to do that check manually. So we have to clamp it to the screen. So we can do new position.x equals mathf.clamp. And it takes in the current value, which is new position.x. This is the current, the minimum, and the maximum. So the minimum, we can put in 0, which it will clamp it right at the edge of the screen. And then for the maximum, we can put screen.width for the x. And you can just copy that line and replace the x with the y. And instead of the width, we do a height. Now we're going to actually want to add some padding to this, but I'll show you how to do that later. All right, and now that we have the new position, we can do input state.change. We can change the virtual mouse.position with our new position. And let's also change the input state. So input state.change virtual mouse.delta with our delta value. So now we're changing the virtual mouse to take in a new position and a new delta value. Now this is for movement. If we actually want to click a button, which obviously we do, we need to do something else. So we only want to do this when our button state has changed. For example, if we're pressing it down, we want to change it to be pressed down. But when we release our finger, we want to emit a state change within the input system. So we only want to do this if the previous state does not equal the current state. So for that, let's take into account the previous state, which would just be a simple Boolean. So private bool previous mouse state. You can just copy that. And then if you go down here, you can do a simple if statement. So if the previous mouse state does not equal, and then in this case, I'm just going to use the A button of the gamepad. You can change this later if you want. So gamepad.current.A button.is pressed. So if we haven't been pressing it before and we are now, or vice versa, then let's emit a state change. In this case, we're going to have to do something a little different. So we can do virtual mouse.copy state, and we have to add these brackets here and pass in a mouse state. So this is the type. And what we're going to do here is do out var mouse state. So basically what we're doing here is we're outputting this variable called mouse state that we can use now within this if statement scope. And it's basically just copying the state of the current virtual mouse. So now we can use it mouse state. And I made a little mistake. This should be lowercase because we don't want it clashing with the type name. So now we can do mouse state dot with button. So here we're changing the state of the button that we're pressing. So we can do mouse button dot left So remember, this is the virtual mouse. So on the gamepad, we'd be pressing the A button, and we're mapping that to our mouse left button, or the virtual mouse left button. And then we want to change it with the gamepad.current.abutton.isPressed, and make sure this is capitalized. All right, and then we can do input state.change virtual mouse with our new mouse state. And make sure to store the previous mouse state, which is this, gamepad current A button is pressed, which let's actually store this. Bool A button is pressed, since we're calling it so many times. Right, so is it pressed? Make sure it's capitalized with the parentheses. And let's just replace these two instances with our new Boolean. And let's just store our previous mouse state with A button is pressed. All right, so this will move the virtual mouse in accordance to our gamepad input. Now we actually have to change the cursor on the screen. So we're just gonna make a function for this called anchor cursor, or you can name it whatever you want. And we're gonna be passing in a new position. So we can do here private void anchor cursor, and take in a vector2 position. So this is the position that we want to move our cursor to. So this is a little bit tricky. You'd think, hey, we can just set the anchored position directly as so, cursor transform.anchored position equals position. However, there's a lot of scaling issues, especially when you have screens of different sizes. This will not work properly with the scale. Additionally, if you have a canvas scaler and you use scale with screen size, then if you set the anchored position directly, it also won't work. What you need is a way to map a position, a screen coordinate position, which is what we're passing in right now. We're passing in a position in screen coordinates to a rect transform coordinate. And Unity has something for this, luckily. So let's just erase this here. And I'm going to declare a variable called vector2 anchored position. So this is going to be the position we move the cursor to. And we can use something called rect transform utility dot screen point to local point in rectangle. And what we do here is that we pass in these arguments. So here we pass in the rect transform of our canvas. So we need a reference to that. Then we pass in the position, our camera, and it'll give us our anchored position called local point, which we'll just pass in this variable that we made. So let's get a reference to our canvas transform. Serialized field, private rect transform, canvas transform. You can call it canvas rect transform to be more accurate. And then if you're using screen space overlay, you don't need the main camera. But if you're using screen space camera, then you do need a reference to the camera. So we're just gonna get a reference to the camera as well here. Private camera, main camera. And in the onEnable function, I'll just do main camera equals camera.main. And this will only work if you have your main camera tagged here as main camera. So once you have a reference to your main camera, we can go down here. We can pass in the canvas rect transform. We can pass in the position, the camera, and this is only if it's in screen space mode. So if you want to do an if statement to check what mode you're in, you can get a reference to the canvas, which once again, we go back up here, we get a reference to our canvas. Lots of references here. Private canvas, and we can do canvas. And right back here, we can do canvas.render mode. And if the render mode is render mode.screenspace overlay, then we don't need a camera reference, else we can just pass in the main camera. And finally, we can do out anchored position. So what this is doing is just a simple way to do an if statement in one line. So if it's a screen space overlay, question mark, is it? Yes. If it is, it's null. Else we do this colon, we pass in the main camera, and we output our anchored position. And I just want to thank Aether Omar, sorry if I mispronounced that, because this video helped me out with figuring out how to use this function. All right, now that we have our position, now we can just simply do cursor transform anchored position equals anchored position. And now our cursor will follow accordingly. All right, so that was quite a doozy. Let's see if this actually works. So let's go back to Unity, and in our gamepad cursor game object, let's pass in a couple of things here. So pass in the cursor transform. So drag your cursor to cursor transform, drag the canvas to the canvas, And also drag the canvas to the canvas rect transform. And then we need a player input component. So you can just make a player input component here if you don't have one already. And if you do have an input action asset, you can just use yours. I'm just going to create a new one. So create actions, and I'm going to put it under scripts here, and I'm just going to save. Then under scripts, we have our input action asset. So we'll have to change some stuff here in a second, but back to the gamepad cursor, we can now drag our input action asset into our player input. And you can also drag your event system to the UI input module. And also you can drag your main camera to the camera if you want. And so for the event system, now instead of using the default input actions, let's just use ours. And you'll see it'll replace it immediately. And then you'll see we have a warning here that something should be set to pass through so it can work properly between different devices. So I don't know why it doesn't do that automatically, but if you go back to the input action asset under the UI navigate, just set it to pass through here and save your asset. All right, and now that we have that, let's add this stuff to our input action asset that we need for our virtual mouse. So what we need is under point. This is what determines if the cursor is over the UI object. So here we can add a new binding, and under the path here, we can add a virtual mouse position. So the position of the virtual mouse. Then under click, which is, we click the button, we need to add in the virtual mouse, left click. So let's add a binding here, virtual mouse, let's put left button. And then if you want to add a scroll wheel, you can add a binding for that as well. And we can just do a virtual mouse, scroll. And then something else you want to do is under the control schemes, go to Gamepad, and then go back here, click Edit Control Scheme. And so you'll see that for the Gamepad control scheme, you need a gamepad required. However, I also added here a virtual mouse, and I put it as optional. And I click Save, and just save your asset. And then for the new bindings that we added for the virtual mouse, I just put them under the gamepad because this is only going to happen when we're using the gamepad. And with the player input component, it always chooses a control scheme one at a time. So if we switch from keyboard to mouse to gamepad, we want to make sure that it allows a virtual mouse. All right, so now you can exit out of that. And before we press play, make sure to drag your player input component into your gamepad cursor script. What I'm going to do is under the button, to make it easier to see, I'm going to make the pressed color red and the highlighted color blue and the selected color light blue. All right, so if we click play, you'll see that we can move our cursor around with the gamepad stick, which is really cool. I have an Xbox connected to my computer and Unity just recognizes it. However, we can't actually click the button. We can click it with the mouse, but not with this cursor. So there's a lot of steps involved in this and a lot of things can go wrong. So let's make sure the pivot is at the center. We don't have the raycast target selected. And in the input action asset, under click, let's actually also add a binding here. I'm just gonna click listen and press A on the button south of the gamepad so that it also registers the gamepad if the virtual mouse left button is not working. Make sure to assign the gamepad control scheme to it. Save your asset. Hey, this is Sam from the future, realizing that I made a mistake. So here, when we're adding the mouse to our input system device, you can see that when we go to Window, Analysis, Input Debugger, we're not actually removing it when we're done using it. So now we have a bunch of devices like virtual mouse 1, 2, 3, etc. And when you click play, you'll see that we have a user, which is our player input that made a user. And you can see the paired devices. So you can see that when we move the gamepad, it's paired to the first virtual mouse. However, the virtual mouse that's actually getting moved is the latest one, which is virtual mouse 3. If you double click it, it opens up this window and you can see under position, it is changing. So it's not pairing the correct virtual mouse. So make sure to delete all of these virtual mices. You can right click and remove device on each one of them. And then back in the code, in the onDisable function, you can do input system.remove device, and you can pass in the virtual mouse so that it removes itself after it's being done used. Now we open back up the input debugger from window analysis. You see when we click play, we get a new device added, which is the virtual mouse. And when we unclick play, then it disappears. All right, so we click this button, everything's fine. Now we move our gamepad and it works as well. Awesome. And you can see if we go to our canvas and you change the UI scale mode to scale with screen size, and you put a reference resolution of whatever you want, in this case I put 1920 by 1080, then it also works the same. So you can use any canvas mode you want. For example, we can put screen space camera and then attach our camera here, and if we move it over the button, you'll see that it works the same, which is awesome. Alright, so that's great, but what if we're switching between the mouse and the keyboard? Let's say the mouse is over here, and you see the gamepad's down here. So we want to be able to use the mouse when we're moving it and not see the gamepad cursor, but also only see the gamepad cursor when we're using the gamepad and not see the mouse. So we can do that easily with the player input component. They have a function called OnControlsChanged that we can subscribe to and see what control the user is currently using. And we also want to add some padding so that the cursor isn't cut off here. So back to the script, and let's quickly add some padding. So for the padding, you can just do a serialized field here, so you can change it while you're in play mode. And you can do private float padding, and you can set a value. I found 35 to be a nice value, 35F. And then for the padding, all we have to do is go down to the update motion function. And then right here where we clamp the values, we just want to add our padding. So instead of 0, we can add the padding. And then for the maximum, we can do the width minus the padding, and then the height minus the padding. And I can just erase this. So that's pretty simple. If we go to here now in the play mode, you'll see that now the padding is working properly. You might want to change it a little depending on your setup, which we can easily increase the padding here, maybe to 50. And you'll see that now it doesn't go in the corners. So I can just set that to 50 here, and I'll just change the default value. Alright, so now that we have the padding done, let's subscribe to that player input function so that we can get an event notification when the player has changed their controls. So you can do it directly from the editor here. There's send messages. There's also invoke Unity events or invoke C# events. I found that the Unity events one didn't work. However, if we set the behavior to invoke C# events, and then you go to your script, then in our onEnable function, right down here, we can do PlayerInput.OnControlsChanged plus equals, and then we're going to make a function called OnControlsChanged. And we can just copy that, and in the onDisable function, we can paste it and put minus equals because we want to unsubscribe from this event. So I'm just going to copy this function name, and down here we can do private void OnControlsChanged, and it takes in a parameter player input, which I'm just going to call input. So this is called whenever the player changes the current control. So we're switching from keyboard to gamepad and vice versa. So we want to do a simple if statement to check if the current control scheme does not match the previous one. Specifically, if the current one is keyboard and mouse and the previous one is gamepad, or vice versa. So if we go up, I'm just going to declare these values so we can make it easier for us. So we can do private const string, and we can call this gamepad scheme, and call this gamepad. So basically we have to index this with a string. So instead of using it constantly, let's just store it up here as a constant variable. And we can do the same, private const string, mouse scheme. And this one in this case is called keyboard and mouse, similar to how the input debugger displays it. All right, so now if we go back down to our OnControlsChanged, we can do if, you can use this player input or the one we have stored already, if player input.current control scheme equals, and let's do mouse scheme, and we have to set some previous control scheme does not equal the mouse scheme, then we want to do a couple stuff. So first let's declare this previous control scheme. So if you scroll all the way up, and it's just right here, we can do private string and previous control scheme, and we can just set it to default string here. All right, and now if we scroll back down, we got that error out of the way. So once we switch to the mouse, we want to do some stuff. First, we want to set the cursor to false so we don't see it. So we can do cursor transform .game object, get the reference to the game object, .set active, and then we can just put false in there. Then we want to make the cursor visible. So we can do cursor.visible equals true, which is the mouse cursor, not the gamepad cursor. Then we want to set the previous control scheme now to the mouse scheme so we can remember our previous control scheme. So the next time we change it, we can remember what the previous one was. And we also want to make it seamless so that the mouse ends up where the gamepad cursor was, position-wise. So to do that, we first need a reference to the current mouse, which we don't have, so we can go up here and we can just declare somewhere private mouse, current mouse. And then in the onEnable function, we can do something like current mouse equals mouse.current and get a reference to the mouse. All right, and now we can scroll back down, and now we have a reference to the mouse. We can do current mouse dot warp cursor position. So this changes the position of the system mouse, and we'll change the position to match our virtual mouse position. Virtual mouse dot position dot read value, which our virtual mouse is basically being driven by our gamepad. All right, so this is one case. In the other case, else if the current control scheme is the gamepad, so PlayerInput.current control scheme equals gamepad scheme. So now we're switching to the gamepad because that's the current. And the previous control scheme does not equal the gamepad scheme. Then it's kind of the opposite of the other one. We want to do cursor transform.gameObject.setActive equals to true. Now we want to set the image active. Then we want to do cursor.visible equals false. And we want to make sure to set the previous control scheme now to the gamepad scheme. And finally, we want to do two things. So we want to change the virtual mouse to match the actual mouse position so the transition is seamless. So similar to how we do it up here, in the update motion function where we do input state.change virtual mouse position, we're just going to do it down here. Input state.change. We do virtual mouse.position. And we want to change the virtual mouse position to match the current mouse position. So current mouse.position.read value. And then we want to actually change the cursor image location to match our new virtual mouse. So we can do anchor cursor. And we can just now do current mouse.position.read value. And so quick mention, if this isn't working for you, like this isn't getting called for some reason, then you can always do it manually. So you can have like this update function as an example, and you can do, if the previous control scheme does not equal the PlayerInput.current control scheme, then you can call your, OnControlsChanged function. And you can just set the previous control scheme here to equal the current control scheme. This is just if for some reason, this isn't working right, because I've heard that there are some bugs with this. All right, and now back to the editor. If you click play, you move the mouse around, and then when we move the gamepad, you'll see that it starts from where the mouse left off, and vice versa, the mouse now starts off from where the gamepad is. And what I've done is, under the canvas, I've also just disabled the cursor so that it doesn't appear when it's at the start. You'll see that it appears because the OnControlsChanged event hasn't been called yet because no controls have been changed. So to fix that, you can just disable this cursor image, and now it won't show. And finally, to avoid any of those errors you saw with the null reference errors that sometimes pop up, in the onDisable here, when we remove the device, just make sure to check that it actually exists. So if virtual mouse is not equal null, and it has been added, so virtual mouse.added, then we can remove it from the input system. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this video. You can see that we can click this button and we switch to the gamepad, and now we can switch this button. And we can also add a scroll view. So I'm just going to move it down, and you see that when we hover over it with the mouse, we can change it, but when we switch to the gamepad, we can also change it, which is pretty cool. And always make sure your cursor is on top of all of the other UI elements, or under, better said. That way it's rendered over these two. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you once again, GeekZebra, for all your help. I'd also like to thank my patrons for all of their support. They make these kinds of videos possible, and I really appreciate their support. So with that, I'd like to introduce my new patrons. In the enthusiastic tier, we have Glenroy Logan, CCXVEE, Justin, Lyra Borealis, Mehface, Trent, Timothy, Manuel, Michelle, and Mice. Thank you so much for the support, I really appreciate it. And in the dedicated tier we have Ian Smith, Yoni Sang, and Final Attack. Thank you so much for all of your support, I really appreciate it. If you're interested, the link is in the description. I offer source code, early access to videos, an exclusive Discord chat, and other perks. And if you haven't joined already, make sure to join our Discord chat where you can chat, post memes, or ask for help. So thank you so much for watching once again. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a lot, and I'll see you next time.